and people would walk up to it and have aesthetic experiences with all the physiological traits. So, standing there, if you had done eye tracking, you would have seen the people's go, and they loved it. And because they loved it, they became much more involved in the conversation. And we weren't trying to create something permanent. They were on foam core, kind of this big, but they now hang in the community. And so what you see is that, and they are beautiful. People said, these are beautiful. They used the word. And because of that, they felt, again, honored and heard and appreciated. And beauty does that.
I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, and this is Beauty at Work, a podcast about how beauty shapes our world and the work that we do. In this season, we're looking at beauty in science. This episode is sponsored by Templeton Religion Trust and the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies at the University of Southern California. More about them later in the show.
Hello and welcome, everyone. I am so thrilled to introduce my guest on the podcast today, Dr. Sheri Parks. Dr. Parks is a public intellectual, strategist, senior higher education professor, administrator, and author, working to bridge the wisdom of communities and the academy to address urgent societal challenges. Her positions have included Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at the Maryland Institute College of Art, an Associate Dean for Research, Interdisciplinary Scholarship and Programming, and Founding Director of the Center for Synergy at the University of Maryland. Her signature public projects include Baltimore Stories, Narrative in the Life of an American City. Sheri, it's such an honor to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's get started by talking about your own background and what drew you to study and pursue aesthetics as a topic of interest.
Well, I've always been a writer. I asked for a printing press when I was 8.
Wow.
That was also my first experience with censorship, since I was very innocently telling about who was going in and out of whose houses. I got shut down. And actually started out being a print journalist, but clearly realized that I had more power than anybody. I had taken all the ethics classes that anybody had taught me how to handle. I went to graduate school to find out how to handle that. But of course, by the time you sit down and think, well, what are the cultural implications of the story that I'm writing? Stories already been written by somebody else. So I stayed and got a Ph.D. I did my master's thesis on gender and race socialization. It was a multiple regression analysis, which was the most sophisticated thing that was going at the time, which predicted the children's attitudes. The paired survey that I gave their parents are the TV shows that they watched. And I found that the TV shows that they watched predicted better their attitudes. The children had a pictorial one that was aligned with the survey that I gave their parents. And parents said, well, they don't watch that show. I doubled back. And if a 5-year-old can tell you 2 complete scenarios of a show, they're watching the show. But it was very clear that I was fascinated by the noise, by the error. There was something that I wasn't grabbing. So I doubled around, very, very supportive advisor, and retrained as an ethnographer.
Wow.
By people who were doing family systems theory for therapists. So the method I used, I actually never taught because it's used on, it was evidently the first non-clinical use that's used on families with someone with schizophrenia because it's very powerful and digs down. So I would be in I didn't sleep there, but I would be in people's homes over a matter of weeks and videotaping, but also interviewing them at the same time. And what I'm trying to figure out is, all the things that not just the media, but the pictures and in one case, the rugs and how families are not inadvertently, because they mean it, but they see all this as play. So it's not part of we're going to teach our children this. And working with the family as co-participants, this is what I think I'm seeing. And,
Mm.
they often were seeing things that they'd never seen before. I had to ask them that in the human subjects. And the way I teach my undergraduates this is that, and they think it's the most lame assignment in the world, follow the dog. Cats are unreliable here.
Yeah.
Follow the dog. The dog will lead you to the hearth room, the room. And families never let you photograph this room because it's usually untidy. But that's where the family pictures are, and, the basketball trophies and the dog's bed, and where you eat and put your feet up and just sit there for 2 hours and watch what happens, and then try to interview the family about what all this means. And, there are technical terms and family mythology and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it ends up being one of their most favorite assignments. And that's the very simplistic idea, is that groups of humans do this, that, there's all the stuff that we put out on purpose, but there's so much stuff that we just do, and we don't question why we do it or how we do it. And that's what I was really interested in. It's like, how does the aesthetics of a family communicate who we are in the world and how we move through the world, and what does this mean? And for instance, this wasn't a study. I was just talking to a faculty member about the work I do. And he said, well, does it have to be a family room? And I said, oh, no, it could be wherever they gather. He showed me a picture of his kitchen that he had helped design. And he was a, very preeminent French horn artist. And I said, oh, I see French horns in your carpet in your kitchen. He said, what are you talking about? And I took my finger and outlined. I said, that's the bell. And, he said, Sheri, I picked out that carpet. I've never seen it the way but now that you pointed it out, I see that I picked a carpet of French horns. And families do that all the time. And it's how families position themselves. And, there's, even when people get partnered, there's this negotiation of all of this kind of meaning. And it's informed by your family of origin and your culture of origin, and, where you think you're going. And so that's how I got started. Okay. And, and that's wonderful, right? But what I've been able to do is to transfer that out into the larger, public sphere, basically. Yeah. So that I've worked with, I can do ethnography with an individual or a family or with a community group. I've done that. Or I do a think-a-thon where it can be citywide, that all of these are ethnographically informed. It's the type of questions I ask and what I ask about. And that's been used. We've done 9 of them in Baltimore, but also in College Park, to help it replan what becomes an art and cultural district, where, communities of culture said, we want people to see that we're here. Fort Worth has used it. All of those are ones in which I've been involved in. A couple of cities have tried it on their own with I think mixed results.
Okay.
But that idea that every day, all day, that we're communicating this information about ourselves and negotiating this information ourselves. And, the way you are wearing your hair and the way you're wearing your glasses, and, this is your summer shirt, I'm sure. I've seen you in your coat and tie. But there's all this stuff that, and this from the neuroscientists that I know you talk to, is that our aesthetic decisions, and I'm using decisions on purpose, are so fast that we don't recognize that they're decisions. Right. It feels like was always there. Yeah. But now that we can trace them, we understand that it goes through that decision-making process. It just goes so fast that we're not self-aware of it. So we're not interrogating it in the way we might interrogate. You may have interrogated your shirt, but it's 90 degrees outside, and you still decided to wear a long sleeve shirt because you're.
It's very cold in here.
Okay, but you're also communicating something, right? When you left your house this morning, it wasn't very cold.
Yeah.
And so we make all of these decisions that move around aesthetics that are communicating things all the time, and negotiating all the time, and without it being monitored or interrogated. And so that's why I'm very interested in it. And certainly, I mentioned culture of origin, because that cultural mix in the United States, when you've got, I don't even know how many ethnic groups, but, in, say, Prince George's County, in Maryland, there's a school district that has 165 languages taught. So we can
Wow.
talk about all of that negotiation that's often silent. And what I mean by negotiation, when I talk to undergraduates, I say, okay, you were 13, you were biologically an adult, but you were still economically and socially and emotionally dependent on your parents. You're angry. You go to your room, what happens? And the white kids say, I slam the door. The kids of color don't slam the door because their parents didn't take the door off the hinges. But then I said, okay, and then what do you do? Now, they're driving this narrative, and they're all saying, then you turn on your music, loud or soft. Oh, as loud as they'll tolerate. What genre? A genre that makes them, that annoys them.
Yeah.
What did you just say? Well, we all know what you just said, right? I can't say it for your podcast, but you said it in a way that they can say, turn that music down, but they won't come back at you for what you just said because it was cloaked.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean by interrogated and not interrogated and negotiated, because you can't say what you want to say because you're so dependent on them. But you find a way, and the aesthetics makes a safer place to say this to them. And families monitor each other's. I worked with a family that said that they spent the evenings together because I asked them to do an inventory of their routine. And this mother and daughter dyad, same gender dyad, said, we spend the evenings together. But wait a minute, they're in a townhome. The daughter comes home before her mother. It took a long time to get to this. She presets the TV to the station that her mother will watch when she comes home. She gets something to eat. She's also preset the volume. And now she's learning this as she's saying it, right? She goes upstairs to do her homework. The mother comes home, daughter comes down, they talk about their day, she goes back up, mother stays downstairs. Now, they told me that they spend the evening together. But what they're doing is now daughter's preset the TV. If mom just leaves it the way it is, mom's okay. If mom adds music to it, then the daughter starts listening to what music the mom is listening to, and whether it's happy or sad. Mom's doing the same thing. Daughter is listening to music while she does her homework. If, it's just kind of like teenage music, but if it's sad, she'll start paying attention to see how long it goes. And if it's happy, that's fine. But if it's sad, then she goes upstairs. So they are together and apart at the same time. And we do this all the time. I interviewed a dad who they said, music is really important to him. And sometimes he goes out in the driveway to listen to it. Well, in the basement, dad has got a sound system that's better than anything. They said, but it's a Volvo. It's a really good car. And it turns out much later that the dad under the guise of listening to the music in the Volvo, dad is just getting some time away from his family, but he can't say, you're getting on my nerves, and therefore I'm going to put it out like that. Sitting in your driveway is very bizarre. So all day long, we are making choices and talking to each other around aesthetics, but because it's aesthetics and therefore play, it doesn't get, I've said this 3 times already, but it's really important that this is happening all along, and so, as some of the neuroscientists that you and I both have worked with, it takes a millisecond for us to say that person's pretty. Yeah. Well, that's such a complex decision, right? Right. Based on, ethnicity and gender and, social class and, how much money they have to spend on all kinds of things that get to what we consider pretty. And that's really where I'm mucking around in.
Nice. That's fantastic. What fits under the umbrella of aesthetics? What does it encompass?
Well, I take a very multi-pronged and interdisciplinary research approach. And so that instant, as I pointed out, includes what one would call sociology. I'm in American studies, so I can be interdisciplinary and multi-theoretical all the time. So it certainly involves cognition, but it also involves, ritual and pattern. And so I work very hard not to be a one-trick pony. A lot of academics, out of necessity, this is what I do, and and they will try to shove the question into what they do, and I try to take the opposite approach. So how do I what is this thing? And how many things are feeding into it? And, with my training, I can do a fair amount. I mean, I've mentioned quantitative, I've mentioned qualitative.
Yeah.
But then the collaborations then become very important. So, because often, and I'm sure we'll get to this, my work is not just housed in the academy.
Yes.
And the work in the world demands a multi-pronged, multidisciplinary approach. And so I'm very happily mediating between those different fields.
Well, let's talk about that. So what drew you out to expand your work beyond the horizon of the academy? Because a lot of academics, typically we feel a lot of pressure to speak principally to our own communities and then maybe to a few other disciplines that are on the boundaries, but reaching out is not really incentivized.
Well, and it's important to say what I'm about to tell you about happens after I have tenure.
Sure.
Because that's really important. I don't want to mislead people. But I mean, starting as an undergrad, I was an English major at the University of North Carolina. And even though I was in the honors and creative writing, so the writing part, we had to take all of the English major courses. And I was in the Shakespeare class, and I'm not going to say who he was, internationally known Shakespearean. And I was playing. I was having a good time. I was laughing at his Shakespeare jokes. I had found the sonnets to read to the class about the dark-eyed woman. And he asked me to stay after class one day. And he said, have you thought about graduate school? And I said, help me understand what this has to do with being African-American. I'm old, so it's the 20th century. And this internationally known Shakespearean said, what? So neither of us was sophisticated enough. Like if he had said, well, Shakespeare talks about otherness and darkness in ways that are very aligned with the way we think about race in this country, I might have a Ph.D. in English. I went that day and added radio, TV, motion picture as a second major because nobody had to help me understand that those media were important in the lives of Black people. I never felt, I'm the daughter of two public school teachers, which people have said says a lot about me. I've never felt that I had the cultural permission to learn for learn's sake or to create knowledge for knowledge's sake. And I remember overt lessons. My mother would say, you're very intelligent. You owe that to people, right? And so I never felt that I could kind of play. I mean, I was playing, but I had to do it to graduate. So I've always, I create this knowledge and what does it mean? And you can hear the old journalist in me. So I've always had one foot in the academy and one foot out. And yes, there are prices to be paid for that, right?
Can I, before you go, could I ask you, were there cultural expectations just growing up, in your family, in your community, around what you could and couldn't do or shouldn't do, right? So career-wise, so obviously something like Shakespeare didn't make any sense, but did you feel like being a journalist or going into media and doing storytelling, that was more valuable because you could do something and have an impact? Was there anything of that sort, or?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I have two siblings. All three of us, they sometimes look at me, how you use the word, are informational missionaries, meaning that all of us are using knowledge in some way to benefit not just Black people, but the larger society. And that was very much a expectation. The expectation, I mentioned the term family myth, and all families have this kind of, this is who we are in the world. Yeah. And the way I have my students think about it is, if you brought home a lover, if they didn't have these characteristics, how hard would your family work to spit them out? And you can boil it down to two or three things, although, there's a lot of complexity. In my family, we are honest and we are smart. And so my family would work very hard to, I'm divorced, but my husband, when we were having a child, said, what would you do? Would you prefer to have, when we knew it was a girl, ugly or, not with this kind of disabilities, but just not curious, just not, just dull. And I said, we can work with ugly, but I don't know what I do. I don't know what I do with a child who's just not interested and curious in the world. And that's very much. And so what does that mean? That means when I graduate from high school, college is the 13th grade, right? There was no, when I found out that there were people taking gap years, not only was I shocked, but I also knew that I would never be able to do that. Yeah. So yes, this idea that, knowledge is power. If you spent time around, the old Black middle class, not the nouveau riche, that idea that education is something that nobody can ever take away from you, so you get it. But also, my grandfather, who was a farmer, sent all of his daughters to college. There's a whole other reason why the boys had a choice, the girls didn't. They couldn't go into the trades if they wanted to. But that idea that knowledge is something that you must get, and once you get it, you must turn around and use it for the benefit of people. And when I say people, you can hear Black, but part of my mother's career was teaching poor white people in Appalachia, because I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina. So kind of the underserved, the disenfranchised of the world. Yeah. That's what you see me doing.
There's some commitment to justice seems to be underlying all of it.
Very much. Very much so. I mean, my grandfather was a landed farmer. He had children who were mostly teachers, but always that idea that you use that to help people is part of the message. So I couldn't, and see, this is how families work. I can't imagine, that's the part, how culture and families work. I can't imagine doing something just for its own sake. So when I talk about aesthetics, I rarely talk about art for art's sake or beauty for beauty's sake. I talk about it because when you start talking about people who have been underserved, they've never divorced their aesthetic lives from their day-to-day lives. So while I would certainly work with museums, I'm most interested in everything that's different than the museum, because think about working class people, regardless of ethnicity, you will find that their music, or think about, the real use of that, that African pot. You'll see that aesthetics is woven into their day-to-day lives. Working class Black people have, for generations, spent more money on their music than people of other ethnicities. When CDs were important, many families had 2 sets of CDs. The kids and the parents were listening to the same music, actually. But the kids had their own CDs because the parents didn't want peanut butter on their CDs. And it's obviously streaming changes some of that, but in some ways it doesn't. I've done some work in Baltimore with the Painted Screen Society. Mostly a Baltimore thing, but it's a working class white thing where people painted their screen doors. Of course, they didn't have air conditioning. It didn't exist. And partly functional in that people were working long factory jobs. They would come home. Baltimore gets hot in the summer. So you want the screen door, the main door open, but you wanted maybe some privacy. Well, with a painted screen, you can see out, but they can't see in. Just the texture of the paint that they arrived at allows that. And so, you could go down at one point whole blocks of painted screens. Now it's a museum thing because they've been collected, and part of the discussion is how can they be maintained and displayed. There's still houses, obviously, that have them, but notice the function and the scenes are very pastoral. You're talking about white immigrants who are getting painted the scenes from their homelands, actually. And so this marrying of the aesthetic interest or the beauty and their function is very much the same thing. Because even if you think about the emotional, I was in Limerick, Ireland, which has some of the same problems as Baltimore, and they were absolutely shocked that suicide is actually a new thing for African Americans. And they said, wait a minute, you got through slavery and Jim Crow without a high suicide rate? And part of that is attitudes about suicide, but a lot of it is aesthetic, it's foodways and music and spirituality, which is heavily laden with aesthetics. That was emotional survival.
You're listening to Beauty at Work. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Templeton Religion Trust as part of a grant on the aesthetic dimensions of science. Templeton Religion Trust supports projects as well as storytelling related to projects that seek to enrich the conversation about religion. To learn more about them, visit templetonreligiontrust.org. This episode is also sponsored by the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies, a global research center located at the University of Southern California. IACS works to create dialogue, spark ideas, and sustain academic research on Catholic thought, creative imagination, and lived experience. Learn more at iacs.usc.edu. If you're enjoying the show so far, please subscribe to our podcast and take a moment to leave us a review.
Would you use the word beauty in relation to aesthetics there? How do you see the relationship between those two concepts?
I see beauty as a subset of aesthetics because we have to, there are people who are very interested in aesthetics that are grotesque.
Yeah.
And so I use it as the broader sense, but the way many people experience what I'm talking about is in the form of beauty. When we talk about the aesthetic experience, which is a phrase I know you've heard, it is that sense of awe and wonder that usually comes with beauty. Yeah.
So let's talk about then how this gets, I guess, translated to the community and the projects that you've done in the last few years. And maybe one place to start would be the initiative that you, for those of us who are listening on audio, we can't show you the video, but there's a beautiful video that you had helped create about how kids were able to, in collaboration with artists, reimagine their community in Baltimore. Could you tell us a bit about that initiative and how that came about and what happened there?
Well, I have to pay the bills and tell you that this was part of a larger project that was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities,
Sure.
Baltimore Stories and Narrative in the Life of an American City, which actually grew out of the uprising after the killing of Freddie Gray. We had a think-a-thon during the uprising, and a lot of aesthetic remedies came out of that, including corner pop-ups where artists could apply for music, for proposals. And then there were art pop-ups, and there were a lot of things, and they came out of that. But one of the things that came out of this was, lots of people plan things for the community, but how do you help facilitate the voice of the community, and particularly with children? So we went to Barclay Elementary, which is a school, this was a couple of years ago, that had a 97% free meal participation in the city, which becomes important. And we asked them, we didn't use the word utopian, but for your audience, that's what we were asking is, what would utopian Baltimore look like? And first we asked them, what would you tear down? And they said, we'll tear down the gun stores and the liquor stores. One quote was like, how many liquor stores does a neighborhood need? And we brought in, and then we began to ask them to imagine the city they would love to live in. And we brought in two working artists who at the time were, taking notes and sketching after they introduced themselves to the kids. And then they went away and painted. And then we brought it back. And that's what the video shows is first the discussion of the kids. I discovered a level of empathy that if any of you listening or watching have middle school kids are not highly empathetic. But these kids said there is somebody there are people who are worse off than we are. That's a quote, that self-awareness. And they began to build in their imaginations the best homeless shelter. It had a barbershop and a beauty parlor and a kitchen and a dining room for communal meals and all kinds of things. And what became an in joke. And then later they built a bike park. And then for both of them, they talked about green space, which they didn't have. Actually, they have now, and I'd like to think that we're one of the reasons they have now, because right across the street now there's a park.
Great.
Because we sent the pictures to the city planning office. That was an important part of it. But what the kids began to talk about, someone said a squirrel. Just one. And what's brilliant about that is that you need an ecosystem for a squirrel, and so you need a tree, and then maybe if you have tree, you need grass, and in all of the paintings for the artists, because one did a triptych. One is a dreamscape and it has a huge squirrel. And in the video, you see the artist saying, there's a squirrel. And the kids all laugh because the squirrel was really important. And then toward the end, the counselor says they didn't know they were urban planning, but they were. Because I told them I'm going to send, we've got good pictures of this. And we're going to send the pictures to the planning office. What I learned, and I think I know a lot about this stuff, right? But I learned that it's really important when your ideas come back in oil, because both artists used oil, and we didn't tell them to use oil. They just decided separately that they were going to do that. And the kids said, this is real art. And they were very honored by the fact that their work came back in real art.
Hmm.
And the artists were ready to change things. And they said, no, this is perfect. You listened to us. And, and what's really important about that, I'm going to jump to another project that we, based on the NEH, we got funding from the National Science Foundation to work in West Baltimore with the whole community to see how tech could raise their quality of life. And we were doing these these community conversations around, I had a community leader that got us into some pretty desperate spaces, frankly, by vouching for us. And the community first said, well, we don't need a whole lot of tech, but we were bringing in what's called visual journalism, where someone is drawing so that the community can see. And the first one was a very nice lady, but she wasn't from the community. And they treated it like notes. And then we brought in an artist who had lived in the community, who treated it very differently and started doing paintings, would actually take it home and finish it and came back. Very rich, very dense. And people would walk up to it and have aesthetic experiences with all the physiological traits. So, standing there, if you had done eye tracking, you would have seen the people's go, and they loved it. And because they loved it, they became much more involved in the conversation. And we weren't trying to create something permanent. They were on foam core, kind of this big, but they now hang in the community. And so what you see is that, and they are beautiful. People said, these are beautiful. They used the word. And because of that, they felt, again, honored and heard and appreciated. And beauty does that. We know that beauty does that, which is why it's actually very useful, and this is misunderstood, in trauma healing.
Yeah, so because it seems that there's the component of feeling listened to and being heard, but then I'm really struck by the sort of that realness component to it. That this isn't just a sketch. That this isn't oil. There's something that's coming out of permanent, whether it's on foam cork or whatever medium is being used. But there's that permanence of it somehow seems to convey a solidity to that experience, right? It sort of reveals not only that we've heard you, but this matters, and that seems to be really powerful. How does that then communicate or contribute to a sense of justice, or what is the link there?
I'll go back to what I said, that working class people have never disassociated their aesthetic lives from their day-to-day lives. That means that the aesthetic is an extremely powerful tool for social justice. And I actually wrote this proposal. It was a little too outrageous for the funder. But what, my dream, if I ever won the lottery, what I would create would be, nobody has to argue that working class people have, innovative souls, right? Because mainstream culture steals from them, regardless of race, all the time. I actually taught a graduate class where everybody took a different aesthetic thing and traced it from the marginalized culture to the mainstream, and then sometimes tracked it back. And because sometimes the mainstream culture just shakes all the soul out of it and then dumps it. Then people kind of try to grab it back, and sometimes other things. So they were tracing all of that. But my dream is to build this innovation center, because working class people have an intellectual property problem. People just steal their stuff, and nobody. The point of, because one of the things I ask the students is, where does the money come in? And the money always comes in after it's left the core community. But what I want is, if you think about art as cognition, not only, I've talked a lot about its art as communication, but it's also a way of thinking through things. I would like to create this center, this innovation center, where we have resident artists. And if you're either old enough to have seen it the first time or young enough to see it now, in Living Color, there's a character where David Allen Greer says, "Oh, I got a song about that. Want to hear it? I want to do that."
Wow.
And I've actually gotten to interview David Allen Greer, so he doesn't think this is a crazy idea either. Where someone comes in, and if you've had a great grad advisor, this experience, you come in with like a half-baked idea, and they mess with it. My advisor, my very, very indulgent advisor, would turn to me and say, "You are brilliant." Well, I'm thinking, Actually, I think you're brilliant. But anyway, he had taken my half-baked idea and, worked it around. We can do that with art where, someone can come in with this idea, and if you work around it and it comes out the other side because it's gone through kind of this art mechanism, then you've got your innovation. Now, this is not quite as crazy or imaginative as it seems, because I was very interested in Bell Labs because I'm interested in innovation.
Yeah.
And the official history of Bell Labs doesn't mention Black people. There's one kind of curly hair guy in the book that's kind of the official history, but there were Black people at Bell Labs. And they're starting to die, which means there's some urgency to this. And they don't talk about race. They talk about freedom. Freedom to innovate. And, Bell Labs at its heyday was just wildly creative. But I have found their grandsons, because I got to interview a hip hop scientist. Okay. And, his title suggests that he says, I can do science as well as the white guys. And his title suggests that, yes, he can. He said, but when I want to be one with the science, I put on my headphones. They don't know what I'm listening to. I'm listening to hip hop, and that erases all of the cultural assumptions that are based in the science. And I said, so is that what it's like to be an upper class white male? And he said, I think so. And it's the music that brings it home for me. So notice what I'm saying is that he is using art to jump over all of those things that, because as you well know, as a social scientist, the assumptions that are embedded in science, well, all of academia, are just there. They often are not spoken to, which is why, trying to make academia more comfortable for people for whom it wasn't made is so difficult. It's like people don't even know how much of these assumptions are there. But if you move it through an aesthetic experience, that is home. Yeah. The only thing that has to be sterile is the petri dish. All those assumptions are not necessary, or most of them are not necessary. So that's what I mean in terms of social justice, because what would happen if Black people control the means of production? Now, I'm using that phrase on purpose, the means of production, and I can say this as an African-American who has routinely moved back and forth between social classes, like literally since I was in kindergarten. There would be music. There would be food. There would be humor. And so what are all the hoops that we're asking the working class Black girl to jump through to get to the same lab? And that's what I mean in terms of social justice, but also, look at the civil rights movement and the role of music there. So what I'm doing is turning that around and using it intentionally. And I'm not saying that music wasn't used intentionally, but now that we know what's in there, right? And the aesthetic experience and the cognition, we can use it. And I tell my undergraduates when I'm doing this is that I'm giving you the kings of the kingdom. Raise your hand. I will only use this for good, because, Big Pharma tried to hire me. And I was a little confused at first. And he said, he had actually been overhearing a conversation. And he said, you understand why people find things beautiful. Turn that around. You can help us do that. And I was like, is that why people should take pills? And when my mother was ill, I did see an array of beautiful pills. So they did it without me. But that idea of turning this around, and there is an ethical issue, right?
Yeah.
And actually
instrumentalizing it for what?
And I couldn't do this in this environment now, but I have had my students read excerpts from Mein Kampf because Hitler understood this. And if only the evil people understand it, then, we're in trouble. Yeah.
No, that's just, it's really powerful because, I think this is where, a lot of people trivialize aesthetics and beauty as, well, that's just sort of fluffy stuff. But if we don't pay attention to it, we don't realize how it's driving us, how it seduces us, how it can derail us, how it can manipulate us, and becomes incredibly important to understand.
They don't like it when I say this, but the whole American PR marketing machine came after World War II, when people looked and said, how did he do that? Supposedly decent people did awful, horrific things. And you look at the way he used film, the way he used music. He did very consciously so. He's to get, in his mind, get people to fall in love with him.
Yeah. No, aesthetics can certainly be, I mean, that's the heart of propaganda. But you also say it could be a means of healing, and I know you've done some work on healing from trauma. Could you talk about some of that? I mean, how does it help us?
A lot of the humanities talk about the aesthetic as a safe place, as a place to heal the wounded soul. And certainly, and I'm not being disrespectful when I say that the aesthetic has played an enormous role in religion. And you actually can see it in the Western church, where the mainstream churches were beginning to lose parishioners to the Pentecostals because it was more emotionally exciting. And that's where the stained glass comes from. That's when the enormous choirs come in. The idea that they weren't trying to drive people away from spirituality. They were trying to pull them to spirituality. So, but the difference is one thing to describe it, is another to kind of dig into it and start, I'm going to use the word dissecting to see what's happening. And so, the field of trauma therapy, of art therapy, first of all, it works whether you know how it works or why it works. So this is another one of my aborted ideas. And right now I'm in my career where I'm kind of going back and looking at these ideas and saying, can I make this work? Art in a box for kids in refugee camps, where a lot of times they were giving them plush toys. Well, if you're in a refugee camp, one more thing to try to keep clean that your kid loves is probably not the best thing to get.
Yeah.
But art in a box, children, give them crayon and paper, and they will draw. And actually, I talked to somebody who had been a lost boy, and he said, you're going to have to get lots of red, because what they do. And then during an epidemic, I was talking to some people, and they said, we see children digging graves with sticks, pretending. And so those little toy shovels that you get in the summertime for kids. And so this idea that think about, they need lots of red. They see a lot of blood. They're rehearsing it. And what does rehearsal mean? It doesn't mean that they're becoming murderers. They're just trying to work through the trauma by, we've all been to plays or movies where there was something that spoke to us and we felt a little better. So there actually is healing in the art, and the art allows a different thing to happen. A graduate student who's now a professor, who did her dissertation with me, but this is her idea. I just kind of helped, do that advisory thing. She interviewed Black artists who, every time there's another police killing, we see those videos and we all feel something. And there's data already about how that's even more traumatic for Black people, because that's just not like, oh, look at that. That could be my son. That could be me. And so what the artists were, she was surprised to find that the artists were self-consciously working as cultural workers, where they would watch the video, they would digest it, they would paint it so that people could look at it longer and come to some action. So, and she was kind of surprised that they were consciously doing it. Because we all know, and this is very controversial in Black culture. Do you bear witness to every video? But at some point it begins to affect your own mental health. And when is it okay to step away? But that's when the artist steps in, and you can see it, but it's abstracted enough that it doesn't impact you in quite the same way. There's something about the aesthetic that gives you a little distance, that gives you, and sometimes the ability to see more because you can see it more often. And the leader in this, I have to say, is Jackie Armstrong at the Met. The Met had, the Metropolitan Museum has an Office of Education. Most of her work is in the museum, but I'm very interested in taking this out into the world. And that's beginning to happen, to see. Because, you saw it during the worst of COVID, when we made jokes about how streaming went up, how all kinds of aesthetic uses went up. People
Yeah.
were self-medicating.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. You had also talked at our symposium a couple of months ago about this the experience of dance and how that was
Oh, yeah.
transformative for gang members. Could you talk about that?
Sure. So there are dancers who work with, I mentioned the Lost Boys in
Yeah.
West Africa, and these are, young fighters who are usually kidnapped and trained to carry out horrific atrocities. In order to do that, something called dissociation has to happen, where your emotions are really dissociated from what your body is doing. So you're not saying, I'm going to hack this person to death with a machete, and how do I feel about that? Your mind is not processing that. And it's not immediate. It takes a long time. Unfortunately, people have become experts at this. So, but, in some cases, Lost Boys have been rescued, but you can't just kind of say, have a nice life. And so you can spend, and therapy works, you can spend years and years of therapy. But what they found was that you first of all, you cannot dance. You cannot dance without that aesthetic coming into the space. And they found that happened. And when I was at the University of Maryland, we were bringing them in a kind of abstract way. And I said, but we have child soldiers in the United States. And it was Karen Bradley, who is the dance instructor. And she said, who? And I said, young gang members. Doesn't the same thing happen? And it took me a very long time to get the anti-gang unit to trust me, because, who's this obviously middle-class Black woman floating in saying, she wants to do this. And so they tested me in all kinds of ways. And finally, when they decided to, help us, they said, we're going to send you the girls because they're tougher than the boys. And they did. They sent us some very tough girls, and they sent counselors with them. So, and one young woman walked in and said, can I say this word? Can I say the B word on your podcast?
Sure. I mean, we might bleep it out.
Okay. She walked in, and she was physically very large, tall and big. And she said, I'm the baddest in this room. And we can talk about why she felt she needed to say that. I kind of don't have time to go into that. And they began the exercise where show me, because they were making a dance, show me a movement where you have hurt somebody. Now, the day before, that had freaked out the college students. But, these are young gang members. They could do a movement from when they had hurt somebody. But then they asked them, well, now let's do a movement where you have been hurt. Well, that's a whole nother thing. And that took a lot longer. Whereas the college students the day before, could tie into that. And so this same young woman left the circle a couple of times. And we had brought in college students that looked a certain way, no preppies, but people who had tattoos and piercings and, that sort of thing, blue hair. And the students have been trained to not try to pull people back in the circle, but just to go, no, notice I just made an aesthetic train, they have to look a certain way, to just go and sit with people who would sit out. And, gradually they would come back into the circle, and they did a whole dance. And this woman who clearly was showing signs of, this is who I am. It happened to be Valentine's Day, and I was silly enough to, or unwise financially enough, to bring in roses. You know how expensive roses are on Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
And I was another aesthetic thing, and I'm handing out roses, and this woman comes over to me and hugs me and cries. She had done the dance. And then she said, nobody's ever given me roses before. She was different. This was an hour and a half.
Yeah.
And so, sometimes the aesthetic, I don't want to say force, because it always feels more gentle than that, or usually feels more gentle than that, did something that, years of therapy also does. But, and so that idea that you get trauma healing, and now with the neuroscientists, we can begin to measure actually, the responses to the aesthetic. And so we have vastly underestimated the ability of the aesthetic to heal us, to help us move on, to help us imagine the next space, because it's a safe space. I have to say, I don't quite understand the larger society's stubbornness about this. Why we continue to dismiss the muscle of beauty and the aesthetic, even as people use it in their day-to-day lives.
Yeah. Just because it just seems soft and trivial, and maybe it's because it doesn't force, maybe because it's gentle. But the dark side of that is also it could be insidious, right? And so, but I think all the more reason for us to try to understand how it works. Talk about the Indigo Dye Initiative. I mean, that's a more recent project. And
well, it's ongoing right now. Indigo starts in India, but it goes throughout Asia, West Africa, the Caribbean, driven in the 19th, really the 18th century by slavery. So in the United States, are the colonies at the time, indigo, natural indigo, which is used to make dye, was a slave crop. And that's important. So the natural indigo market, which was one of the top two exports of the colonial U.S., almost died out completely because of synthetic dyes. And there's a resurgence now in interest because it is natural and it's one of the natural dyes. It's the most lucrative of the natural dyes because it's the rarest. And so in Baltimore, and it sounds weird because you hear indigo, you think South Carolina.
Yeah.
Our former First Lady, Yumi Hogan, is Korean and grew up in Naju, Korea, same latitude as Baltimore. So she wanted to see first if it would just grow. And so she approached Micah, where she had been a student and an adjunct, to work with urban farmers to see if it would grow. We grew other types of natural dye, but indigo is the money crop, and grew different strains. And long story short, what that grew into is expanding. It came over to my shop to expand it with farmers on the Eastern Shore. We're not excluding farmers, but we're really directing a lot of this to Black farmers who are losing, have a history of discrimination by the lenders, losing Black farms at a rapid rate. Maryland Eastern Shore with the University of Maryland, Eastern Shore, which is HBCU. South Carolina Low Country, so on land that we know that slaves grew it before. And this summer, Virginia and North Carolina. What's important about that is most Black farmers in the U.S. are in these two regions of the Mid-Atlantic and the South. It comes back to Baltimore, where we hire, and we are the market. We give them the seed, which is hard to get, and then we come back and buy the indigo. Then we employ returning citizens to hang it and process it. And we have funding for a building and grinding machines and things like that. And then we're training artists with the lure of, we give you the indigo dye because they can't get it. It's hard to get. They can, but it's rare and expensive. There's only one other company in the United States that does industrial level indigo. And it was where the aesthetic comes in is in so many places. Indigo is sacred in all of those places. And while we're not proselytizing, we honor that. One of my favorite things to do is that we, during the summer, do Arabber carts. So there's a horse-drawn cart. We load on vats of indigo dye, and we go through underserved communities and hand out cotton T-shirts. And Kabibi Ajanku, who's our indigo master teacher, teaches them African-centric designs, and then they dye. And we hand out gloves, which they say, I want my hands blue. And then they do it, and I just watch. Adults report that they feel calmer without knowing the history of indigo, although we tell them a little bit that they feel calmer. There's just so many pictures of people this is more than like finger painting, that this is very important. But we're also creating, so what we're doing, and this is the hard part for somebody to understand, there are people who approach indigo purely for aesthetic, kind of what I'll call play aesthetic reasons. And there are other people who approach it, wait a minute, this is an emerging world market. Because we did the economics, we're academics. We brought in another group that, then brought in economists. And so we know what the market's going to do over the next, both here and internationally. And the Arabber cart, Arabber is a historic term for these. They were actually African-American vendors. There's a long history about why they're called Arabbers. So we're bringing all of these things together, the market sophistication, the aesthetic, the spiritual. We have advisors who are venture capitalists, but and they're not pushing to invest but they're just advising us because this is really interesting. We're working with chemical engineers to optimize the particles. And so we started this conversation talking about bringing all of these things together. But at the core of it is that indigo is beautiful. The returning citizens, meaning that they've been in prison, there's a conversation of whether you bake it dry or you hang it dry. And they said, it's richer when you hang it. And I said, so what is richer? They said, it smells fuller. It looks fuller. We have more dye on our hands when we hang it. So even in the processing, there's aesthetics going on. And so the idea is to weave aesthetics through the entire process. And in some of the urban gardens, Upton Planning Committee, which is the community partner, and getting community members to think about allowing these fields in their neighborhoods, she showed them what the flowers look like. Because with indigo, if you have ever topped off a houseplant, that's what you do twice during the summer, sometimes 3. Then you let it bloom. And so there are these fields of magenta colored flowers. Then you let it go to seed and you collect the seed. So aesthetics isn't this thing that's here. Like our day-to-day lives is woven through the whole thing in a project that is, the way we're designing it, feeding wealth back into the community, both as employees, but we're also working around with alternative, type of shares. It might be just as simple as profit sharing, but we're looking at other models as well. And the whole idea is to raise the quality of life because it's pretty. And the building that has been purchased with the funding is an 1858 colored school, Harriet Beecher Stowe School. There were Harriet Beecher Stowe schools all over the country. And so it was a blighted building and we were restoring it. But also working with there's an art district right there, certainly the only Black art district in Maryland, to train artists to create products for sale. Wow. So I'm kind of the, I don't know, my title keeps changing. And I'm kind of a doer in the middle of this.
But that's amazing to see because it has potential transformative effects on so many levels, right? At the individual level, as people are experiencing their hands turn color and then experiencing this sort of fullness.
Well, and I have to say that African Americans have been alienated from their work since slavery, right? And with this work, because it is so culturally meaningful, because it is beautiful, just watching people do the work, they're not alienated anymore.
It's amazing. What else does the future have to offer? What are you excited about? What's on the horizon? You've got probably so many things on the go.
Well, 2 things actually. One, should I talk about this? The role of, let's say it this way. Historically, HBCUs put welders and artists in the same room because they didn't have the resources to separate them. And I'm working on a project that reunites those 2 groups. Okay. And then crocheting, which is something that working class Black and Latinx women do. And so we're building the Baltimore Crochet Project. Wow. And what's really lovely about crochet, I can say this without giving away too many secrets. Okay. There's a scientific project where the researchers were actually trying to do the artist nice thing. And they were studying the coral reef and they invited some crocheters to just replicate the coral reef. Well, when you have it in your hands and it was the crocheters that said, notice how the pattern changes right here. And that's where the coral was dying. Wow. Yeah. Wow. So you end up with something that has a market. I get to move back and forth between underserved women and, the wealthiest store in Baltimore that says, well, this is going to be, trending for a while now. Wow. And so it's not that they already know how to crochet. They just need better materials and marketing in order to do that. So that kind of thing is that, I get to, I'm having fun.
Fantastic. That's amazing. Where can we direct our viewers and listeners to your work? Where can they learn more?
Well, if I'm emerita at the University of Maryland, and so that email is easy. It's slp@umd.edu, and on my email signature, there's actually a link to Baltimore Stories, which includes.
And we'll put that up on our show notes. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Sheri, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure. Always a pleasure talking to you, and I'm really glad you were able to join us today.
Yeah, thank you. It's been fun.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to this episode of Beauty at Work. Please be sure to check out our show notes for more resources from our guest. And if you like this episode, please be sure to share it with your friends. And please leave us an honest review. We'd love to hear what you think, and it helps to get the word out about our show. Music for the show was provided by Venkat Subramaniam, and the podcast was edited by Dave Visaya from Podcast Engineers. And thanks again to our two sponsors, Templeton Religion Trust and the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies at the University of Southern California. For a research project on beauty and science, visit wellbeinginscience.com. To learn more about our broader project on beauty at work, visit beautyatwork.net. Thanks again, and see you next time.